Fabulous. Okay, I will start with some housekeeping. Welcome. My name is Eloise. I'm the curator at Jupiter Artland. This evening, we are here for the final event of our Extraction public programme. Extraction is Jupiter Artland's current exhibition, and it's on for until just another week, a week and a half, until the 26th of July. So if you haven't visited the exhibition yet, it would be wonderful to welcome people in these final kind of 10 days. Just in terms of the way that the next hour is going to run, this talk is being recorded and we archive the talk on our website and on our YouTube channel, just so everyone's aware. Tonight you can use the chat if you would like to pose any questions, and Janaki, our wonderful curatorial assistant, will be assisting in looking for messages in the chat and making sure if anyone has any technical issues, they can also contact her. She is, her title on here is Exhibitions, if you need to get in touch with her. The other thing to say is that, of course, please be respectful when you're using the chat. I hope that goes without saying. But yeah, let's be kind to one another and hopefully have a really interesting discussion tonight. So yeah, I think that's everything I have to say in terms of housekeeping. I've just got a message to say that some people are struggling to join and unable to join the call. But yeah, Janaki maybe can have a quick look at that. And I think I can hear the sound of people entering the lobby. So let's hope that that's only an issue for some people. So yeah, we will start and hopefully some more people can join if they are currently trapped somewhere in a Teams lobby. I just wanted to start tonight by giving a tiny little introduction to some of the things that we're seeing on screen and also to the exhibition at Jupiter Artland for those of you who maybe are joining from outside of Scotland or haven't had the chance to visit. Extraction is really an exhibition that draws from the landscape around Jupiter. And when like me and the curatorial team were looking and thinking about the land that surrounds our sculpture park and the galleries here, we were thinking a lot about the ways in which different energy eras have had their kind of impact and mark upon not only the land, but upon a lot of the communities that surround us here in West Lothian. And those energy eras, at least the kind of three that are most visibly kind of written on this layer of the landscape are the shale oil industry, the petroleum oil industry, so the North Sea oil industry, and solar. The shale oil industry figures kind of largely in our landscape in the form of the red bings, which you can actually see from the edge of our site here. These are huge piles of waste left over from mining shale for it to be processed into oil. In terms of the North Sea oil, last week we were actually talking about extraction on board a boat sailing down the Forth, because also from the edge of Jupiter you can see where the Forties pipeline, this huge productive oil pipeline, comes into land. It makes land at Grangemouth, which is just over the water from us. And in tandem with opening extraction, Jupiter Artland has switched over to solar power. So also on site, we have this solar field, which is kind of like in itself a sort of huge architectural or almost sculptural installation, which sits at the edge of our site with a wildflower meadow. So we were thinking about all of these different kind of parts and histories to the landscape, thinking also about the kind of cultural and social histories that are associated with those, thinking about extraction, residue, what and who is kind of left behind in these cycles of energy production. The show features work by 5 artists, and just I thought while the three of us speak tonight, we could have some images that are gently rotating in the background of works by John Latham, Siobhan McLaughlin, John Gerard, Carol Rhodes, and Marguerite Humeau. So yeah, these artists working across different decades, across different concerns, are kind of united through this thread of thinking about energy production, thinking about what has been and what comes next. That's definitely enough talking from me alone. And I'm absolutely delighted to tonight be in conversation with Jen Howard Coombs, who is the director of Almond Valley and who has a particular interest and passion, absolutely, in thinking about cultural identity, the way in which communities evolve. And Jen's going to, I hope, talk to us a lot more about Almond Valley and what happens there. And we are joined also by Dr. Catherine Spencer, Senior Lecturer in Art History at the University of St Andrews, who has this incredibly rich expertise on art practices from the 1960s through to the contemporary moment, and whose research, which we're going to get into, I'm sure, is particularly kind of resonant for some of these threads of thinking that make up extraction. So yeah, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. And I think it would be great to start, Jen, actually, for those who maybe have, as I've just introed extraction, for those who've not visited, it would be incredible for you to tell us a bit more about Almond Valley. It's a very special place, and yeah, I'll let you introduce it.
Thank you. I mean, we certainly like to think so. Where to begin with Almond Valley? I think maybe I should begin with my first encounter with Almond Valley, which was with my family some years back, way before the role of director even came to be, and I took it on just 19 months ago. So our first Almond Valley, for those that aren't familiar with it, is now a 23-acre site, but its origins were formed back in the 70s around a small group of people who came together determined not to allow some of the built heritage of the West Lothian region fall away. So we are nestled around and built around this 250-year-old mill farm, a working water wheel, with the River Almond runs right the way through the site. And when now the centre has grown over the last 30 odd years, and it's been shaped and forged and raised back to life by the community in which we reside. And it now is home to the Museum of the Scottish Shale Oil Industry, a rare breed farm, which is a nod to the history of Mill Farm itself. And we are one of the key visitor attractions for the region. We welcome over 150,000 visitors per year. But it's fair to say that the community that brought the site back to life is still at the heart of Almond Valley, and it was that community quite a few years ago when I first came on site. And I'm quite tactile, which is annoying for a lot of museums, in that I tend to walk and touch the things that I should never touch. And my first encounter with the site, I spent a lot of time touching and getting too close to some of the collection within the Museum of the Scottish Shale Oil Industry. And I have to admit, I probably caressed too much the 250-year-old mill that still resides at the heart of the site, thinking if only we could unpick those stories, what would the cobblestones reveal? So it's a wonderful sanctuary. It's a complex space now. But I think our origin story, which began 250 years ago, navigated through the global industry that emerged in the shale industry. And here we are in 2026, really trying to understand how we remain a really wonderful interest and kaleidoscope into the past, but also how we become a portal for the future. And we've got big ambitions. We want to become a real cultural beacon for the region. And we hopefully, to begin to tell a broader narrative about the journey from the industrial revolution, the oil-fueled industrial revolution, and begin to explore the new world of green energy and potentially play our part in shaping a better future.
I mean, it's an incredible provocation. It's an incredible origin moment in so many ways. And yeah, I think your vision for it, and that kind of half an eye on the past and half an eye on the future, um, is really, I think, yeah, is so kind of resonant, and so in so many ways, I think responds to the kinds of desires and needs from the communities that are around you. And yeah, I really encourage anyone if Jen hasn't persuaded you here with the rare breeds combined with the Scottish Shale Oil Museum archive, I don't know what will persuade anyone to visit, because it is just, yeah, an incredible, incredible site. Um, I Maybe it would be helpful, and I can actually kind of pull these up on screen, because I think basically Jen and I came to be in touch because Almond Valley have very kindly loaned some objects for extraction. And when I was curating and putting together the exhibition, I really felt like I needed to go to Almond Valley. I needed to see the collection. In a way, I needed to also touch and caress the collection and have that kind of intimacy with it. And yeah, I think yeah, for anyone who's not seen the show, there are just these just tiny moments where the galleries, kind of filled with contemporary art, are kind of interleaved with these objects which Jen and the team kindly loaned to us. So they are in the Steddings Gallery, we have pieces of shale. And then in the Ballroom Gallery, we have a BP Motor Spirit can. And online as well, Jen and the team really kindly allowed us to select from a range of oral histories. I think it's over 100 oral histories that have been recorded as part of the collection. And yeah, our amazing curatorial team here, Hamish and Janaki, selected and pulled out a few that in particular kind of highlight the voices of women and families, and these stories that surrounded the shale oil industry, and that perhaps are slightly more often overlooked. But there were so many other incredible objects in this collection, Jen, that I mean, I had the best afternoon through the shelves. I mean, there was slabs of paraffin wax from Pumpherston. There were these samples of kind of paraffin, shale oil at different points in its refinement.
That's right, yeah.
Kind of crude oil all the way through to the wax for candles, paraffin lamps. I mean, and yeah, things that were also very much felt very marked by this very kind of human presence, whether that be the pieces of very dark shale carved by workers, or much more almost domestic feeling items that felt very personal. Like, we looked through so many photographs in the archive, but also through greetings cards, or little mementos kept by people. And so yeah, the images up on screen just now are these are the samples of shale, and this, if I can get it to pause, this image in particular shows you almost the sort of life cycle of a piece of shale, from it being mined through to the piece in the middle. It's hard to imagine this looking at it on screen, but this piece in the middle is light as a feather. You can kind of just pick it up because it's had the shale oil extracted from it. I mean, it's an incredibly kind of resonant object to hold. But yeah, I wondered if you wanted, Jen, to give people a sense of what it means, I suppose, to take care of objects in this way through that collection. And it very much, at least when I looked through it, it feels like a collection that is very community sourced, very much has community at its heart. It's kind of driven by this desire to, I suppose, archive and reflect on people's lived experiences.
Totally. I think what I loved about coming to see your exhibition was the juxtaposition of contemporary artworks alongside some really rudimentary functional objects such as the BP canister. But across everything, there are a million stories and ideas and context to explore. And I think that's at the heart of the museum. And we've got big plans for the museum, I feel, of funding and trying to evolve this site to make sure it kind of survives and that it can continue has meant that the museum hasn't had the investment that it's really needed to flourish. But that plan, we have a big ambitious plan for the future. But the collection for me, the collection in all of its guises, we have a wonderful array of maps. And I'm, you know, a lot of people smile politely at me when I talk about my obsession with maps because and obsession with bridges, because I think they speak to human endeavour, aspirations and the hopes of so many and the hardships. And I think that's exactly what the Shale Museum also speaks to. The job itself wasn't the job of one person. If you worked in a mine, whether it be a shale mine or a coal mine, and this is ubiquitous across the globe, it's seldom a job for one individual. It was very much not only a family role, but it was a community role. And that screams out from the maps that we hold, from the objects like the BP canisters, the lamps that we have, the paraffin lamps, the candles, the lovely shale carvings that we have from miners who spent so much time in the dark, and in the few minutes they had would soothe themselves, creating something of exquisite beauty. So our collection and all the stories we've revealed and all the stories we're yet to reveal, for me, genuinely is absolutely anchored in the potential of human beings, the potential of humanities, this endless journey that we're on. And it does scream of all the hopes and the endeavours and the hardships, the innovation. And you talk about the challenges. When I first took on this role, I spoke with so many people at a really local level, different generations as well, sensitive to the fact that actually to give life and do justice to the collection and the people that help forge a global industry. What I have to do, my role and the role of Almond Valley, is also to give it context and credibility for the next generation, the future history makers. How do we make it something that they want to hold up and love and celebrate and use it as a tool to inspire? And that is a challenge. It's a challenge because of in the current context, I spoke to many of the older generation mining families who talked about, in one way or other, feeling slightly cancelled by their grandchildren who, you know, kind of slightly shunned the idea that their grandparents, their great-grandparents were involved in a global industry. And I think it's our role to not avoid those difficult conversations, but actually to wade right in there, if I'm really honest, wearing my miner's boots, passed down, to dig in and find a way, find the pathways to connect those generations and pull out the things that will always be true of any industry, of anything that we do, the good and the bad. There will always be elements that you can always pull forward. And that's our ambition for the future, is to find those pathways and ignite and inspire the next generation. Big ambitions.
big ambitions. I think, a few things stand out to me about that. It's interesting because when we were recently speaking at another extraction event with Dr. Ewan Gibbs from the University of Glasgow, he was really, we were really getting into the fact that the coal mining industry in its moment was innovative, was huge, you know, had this huge kind of innovation behind it, and was incredibly cutting edge, basically. And it's really easy to like lose grasp of that. And I think that certainly when I came to Almond Valley, I felt like something that's really rich about it as a place is that you manage to be attentive to those tensions, to that idea that, you know, yeah, of course, like we can talk about a just transition, but what does that actually mean for people? What does that mean for communities? And what does that, I don't know, what are the ways in which we can kind of cut through, I don't know, discussions that maybe feel quite divisive. And I think holding those tensions is actually really tough. And I think that that really grows out of, again, that sort of like being almost like a community source, or having this having this kind of community almost like ethos at the center of what you do. And I think it also comes out, Jen, for me, in the way in which Almond Valley feels like it holds I don't know, you can have this sense of suffering, of injustice. I mean, some of the things that I saw at the museum were like horrifying in terms of the hardships, in terms of like collective energy, which has been put into this. But then the kind of flip side of that was that so many of the objects that we looked through together, and so much of what is on display in your visitor center, also speaks very strongly, I think, about community. I mean, people talking about, there's kind of an account which swings wildly from speaking about picking wild strawberries on the shale bings, and sort of like this sense of being very kind of held by family and community, through to, yeah, the kind of medical disastrous medical like kind of impacts of working in that environment and of breathing that in. And yeah, I think it's a tough thing actually for a collection to kind of hold all of that, and to speak of all of that, and speak kind of clearly about all of that. So yeah, I think that's a very kind of rich theme, and in many ways that's born out of those people's experiences, of the kind of diversity of experience. And yeah, I think it's very much like writ large in your collection and in your kind of ambitions for it. Um, yeah, so much to reflect on. I think um, thinking about kind of objects and these kinds of resonant histories that they might hold, and kind of the way in which our culture kind of can be a sort of conduit for some of these ways of thinking. Um, Catherine, you've written and curated so gorgeously on kind of art practices that map onto some of these timelines that we're talking about, and often using and through this a kind of intersectional lens, and very much a political lens too. Um, and I think it would be really wonderful if you wouldn't mind introducing us a little bit to some of your ideas around landscape, politics, abstraction, extraction, and these kinds of ideas that feel quite resonant for some of these works.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for this really lovely invitation. And it's amazing to be thinking about my research in dialogue with the Extraction exhibition, both with the artworks in it, but also the amazing items from Almond Valley, which are really resonant and have lots of connections. And Eloise, I love the way you've thought about the exhibition in relationship to the landscape around Jupiter. And so the landscape itself is also, I think, part of your project, which is really, really powerful. So I'll just share a little bit about my current research, which is a book project called Abstract Subjects. And it thinks about the interaction between landscape, politics, and formal processes of abstraction in art practice since the 1960s in the UK. And I've been looking at a real range of artworks by artists including Frank Bowling, Sonia Barrett, Annalie Davis, Rita Donner, Veronica Ryan, Prunella Clough, Rashid Areen, and also Carol Rhodes. So there's a really direct connection with extraction in Rhodes's work. And in that project, I'm thinking in particular about the connection between art practices and processes of bordering. So I've been looking in particular about changes in immigration law in the UK and its relationship with art practice, but then about the border as a psychological state, as a metaphorical state, and as a conceptual state. And there are obviously links there with the kinds of energy infrastructures that the Extraction exhibition has been tracing in such an interesting way. And ecological considerations play a key role in a lot of the works that I'm looking at, particularly because they're thinking about this layering of different energy infrastructures over the landscape, what that does to the landscape, how it can make that landscape very inaccessible to the embodied subject. So that idea of bordering comes back in. And the chapter that I'm working on at the moment actually looks a lot at Carol Rhodes's work in particular. So I think we can see some of these ideas about bordering and their implications in Carol's work in particular. And I've been working with this concept of the borderscape, which is an interdisciplinary concept that comes from geography and international relations. And rather than thinking about borders as fixed entities, it thinks about them as sites that proliferate throughout daily life in myriad ways, both tangible, but also very abstract, very ephemeral. And I think Rhodes's work is particularly interesting in that respect. And so I was really struck by the inclusion of the work deposit in extraction. And I think it speaks really strongly to both the themes of the show as a whole, but also to the research that I've been doing. And this is a painting which is on the slides that are coming past, so hopefully it will come back round soon. And it's a painting in which we see large-scale infrastructure. I think in this case of roads, in other of Carol's paintings, it's rivers and canals and airports that create these bifurcations within the landscape. And I think a lot of people have talked about the role of the aerial view in Carol's work, and I'm interested in it precisely because it has that cartographic effect. So it has that connection with mapping as a way of trying to survey and control the landscape and extract from it. And I just wanted to share a quote from Rhodes, which I think is a really beautiful evocation of her interest in the aerial view, where she talks about the role of control, but she says that for her, the aerial view in her work is not actually undertaken, quote, from a position of power. It's from a position of being wounded or something like that. When children are very ill, they can have the sensation of leaving their bodies, or when they are in some kind of danger, they can see from above themselves an out-of-body experience. That strikes home. If anybody is interested in control, it is always because they can't cope. I'm sure that is there in the work. And that, again, really speaks to me about the complexity of bordering as a phenomenon that both speaks of control, but also lack of control. She's also talked about how her landscapes, if you went into them, they wouldn't have people in them. They're kind of absent of people. And I think there's a really interesting tension in her work between this, again, that comes from the aerial view that suggests that this is landscape that you can know because you can see it all laid out for you. But there is also a sense with her work, I think, that if you were to actually go into that landscape, it would be extremely difficult to move around in as an embodied subject because of all of the activities and all of the infrastructures that have grown up within the land. So Carol's work has been really important for my current research. And there are some really strong connections between her work and the work of another artist I've been looking at called Prunella Clough, who's also got some images cycling through in the slides that I just thought I'd share. Because again, these are works that also think about peripheral spaces and edges. And Clough was particularly interested in the concept of the edge, so being at the edges of things. So things that are overlooked or have maybe been layered over, lost to view, that she's seeking to kind of recenter or bring attention to in these canvases. And she was, very preoccupied with the kind of liminal spaces that I think, again, the works in extraction also draw attention to, particularly the works that engage with the shale bings, for example. And the edge in her work is both a formal device, so we see this fusion between the abstraction in the paintings formally speaking, but also, again, the edges of the landscape, points where it's become difficult to see things, or the way has become barred, like in this image wasteland on the slide at the moment. And I think she's constantly thinking about the role of abstraction in relationship to extraction, in relationship to energy, and the kinds of infrastructures that Rhodes is also thinking about. And then one of the other artists I'm also thinking about in the mix is Veronica Ryan, who thinks much more psychologically about the need for containment, or the need for bordering, sometimes for protection. But I think her recent work has also used waste materials in really interesting ways that we could think of as some of the products of the infrastructures that Clough and Rhodes and the artists in abstraction are thinking about and working with. And I was thinking there were some nice connections between her work and that of Marguerite Hermot in the show, where we get these remakings of materials and kind of new worlds emerging through these very tactile, very material works that often involve, in Ryan's case, things like plastic bottles, takeaway containers, plastic fishing wire, those kinds of materials. So I was also, I'm interested in the abstraction in the works in the Extraction exhibition, but also in the materiality of a lot of the works as well. So I'll stop talking because I don't want to go on too much, Eloise, but if there's anything you wanted to pick up on.
This is, so many kind of ideas bouncing off one another, but I love this phrase that you used, Catherine, about mapping but not from a position of power. And I think this speaks, I don't know, that really speaks to me and speaks very much to some of the things that we looked at in the archive with Jen. I think this idea of almost like annotating and viewing a land, but almost from this perspective that actually is kind of not about extractive kind of capital gain. And in the archive at Almond Valley, I should say, some of the maps are the kind of polar opposite of that. They are very much about what can the land give us. They map these potential sites. There's kind of blueprints for buildings. I mean, they are incredibly gorgeous aesthetic objects, and they're very charged with this idea that that kind of land can be mapped and that it is a resource to be taken, and that kind of whatever workforce are needed and often kind of feel expendable for that to be brought to fruition is something that I really, really felt while kind of looking through those documents. So I wrote down this little phrase and put a star next to it. That's just, I don't know, that feels very like something I'm going to keep thinking about. Love this idea of things that have kind of become lost to some people's view being recentered, and I think that those processes are so gorgeous. I think it's Carol's work, like including Carol's work in the show, just felt it felt like a very apt gesture and a kind of apt inclusion. I mean, she spent quite a lot of time traveling between Edinburgh and Glasgow and observing this landscape very kind of watchfully and very closely, actually. And I mean, we see in some of the slides that have been on screen her kind of large annotated drawing that's included in the show, which is almost certainly of the Five Sisters Bing, not far from us, and the same Shale Bing that inspired Latham's work so closely. Including that work, I feel I sort of really felt this same tension you're describing, Catherine, and in a way I find something about deposits is actually quite kind of brings me back to the body, in the fact that I think the abstraction is kind of almost fleshy. It's kind of, it has a kind of like beautiful sensual element to it, I think, as well as, so it holds you kind of close, and it kind of has this tactile feel for me. And Carol's layers of paint are very we're going to see deposits now, which is just these kind of very she painted wet on wet, So when she was applying those layers, and you can kind of really, although they're very dry objects now, you really feel those kinds of layers being built up. And yeah, I think the way in which she kind of keeps you distant and does that kind of mapping, as well as draws you close with this, yeah, very, very, what feels to me like a very tactile kind of abstraction, I think is a very, very lovely tension. It's interesting that I think in both the archival objects and in the artworks, I kind of keep coming back to these ideas about tactile, about touch, about that kind of materiality. And yeah, just to pick up on something else you're saying about this kind of materiality that's born out of waste, I think that for me is something that you know, we saw in the Almond Valley archive, in those cast off pieces of shale that have been touched and shaped and carved, but is also something that I tried to weave into the show through including not only Marguerite's works, but Siobhan McLaughlin's 2 paintings as well, which are made of earth pigments from various mined sites, actually. They're not only from the shale bings here near Jupiter. I think there are also some pigments in there which are from a Cornish mine, which is kind of where you get some of those very deep greys from. But yeah, this idea that you know, there's really something that we can do with these kinds of these materials that themselves are quite historied. You know, they're kind of they have a lot to say for themselves in so many ways, but this kind of transformation of materials through the artwork is something I was really, really interested in. And yeah, I think Marguerite does it in a kind of, in quite a sci-fi way, thinking, you know, using venom and yeast to think about, I suppose, like different organizational structures, ways in which we might in future have energy infrastructure which is not recognizable to us today, and isn't these same forms of kind of mining or extraction from the land, but which kind of draws on, yeah, these ideas of symbiosis, whether that be how termites live together or how bees organize themselves in a hive, which is why the honey holder in this slide is made of beeswax and kind of has this incredible smell to it in the gallery, actually. So yeah, I think really what a big thing that I take away from your kind of research interest, Catherine, is like the possibilities, I suppose, of abstraction, the possibilities of kind of making fictions that really probe these questions, actually, that aren't toothless, that really feel like they explore these ideas in very nuanced ways. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that little bit of insight. And yeah, some of those images of artists that Catherine was just talking about are kind of included at the end. So some of these images are not from extraction, but hopefully you can recognize as they cycle around some of the artist names that Catherine's just mentioned. I thought it would be really lovely for us to talk all together really about activism and struggle, and sort of how that might be woven into both these art practices that we're talking about, and also into, I mean, it's an essential part of the tapestry that is Almond Valley, I think. This idea of struggle, activism, protest. We had one of the lovely images that we have alongside the oral histories is of a, albeit peaceful, but a sit-in at one of the mines. So yeah, I think I don't know, Jen, do you want to tell us a little bit more about, I don't know, I suppose, why activism is a vital part of this story? I mean, it's kind of about agency as well.
It's absolutely about agency. I don't see, I think it's a part of the human narrative, isn't it? Activism, since time began, really. And I think right across multiple industries, especially industries where people have to rub shoulders together, where they sweat and rarely go through it together, you'll often see many people eventually reach a point where they're galvanized to stand up and challenge the status quo. And I think it's, yeah, and that's all across. You can go to the fishing industry in Hull, for example, and you'll hear the stories of Big Lily Bullock, who stood up and marched to London to challenge the status quo and to challenge the real hardship that they were all facing. And it's the same with the shale and the wider coal mining industry. I think what's interesting for me when you look through our archive, the real challenges begin to emerge towards the end, the demise of the industry itself. It's not to say it wasn't there in the beginning, but as you saw the decline of the industry, so as you got into the kind of late 19th century, then what you saw was the emergence of unions. You saw the emergence of the federation, the West Lothian Labour Federation, and it was a small group of people that came together to stand up and protest against the conditions, not just the working conditions, but the homes. Back at the peak of the industry, you're talking like 1-2% of people had their own home. The vast majority of people were in rented accommodation, living in real poverty. And as with any emerging industry, the power sat at the very tip of that pyramid, almost the very top of the shale pyramids of West Lothian, in a sense. So the companies own the housing. They also owned the shops. They had power over supply. They would set the prices for people, and people endured that alongside the hardship of working in quite a brutal industry itself. An industry that, let's remember, was only enabled because of the people. It was only enabled through migration, through the blood, sweat and tears of so many people who came together to make it possible. Yes, you can say that you can recognize the big names of the industry, and there we go, that's me. I've got my box out and I'm stood on it. A big job, I think, for us actually is not just to speak to the James Youngs of the world, but is actually to speak to some of those people that were represented in the whole oral history programme, and to really bring their voice to the forefront of it as well. But yeah, I mean, towards the end, we saw wages being cut, we saw working hours being increased, we saw price points for the most basic assets for people being increased as companies were desperately trying to make profit out of a declining sector, and they were unable to drive innovation to evolve rapidly enough, and they'd once fed the globe, and they were facing that challenge from across the globe. But even in advance of that, unions were starting to emerge already, or at least small pockets of people were starting to realise that actually there is real power in collective voice, in collective action. And actually, maybe drawing back to Almond Valley, we're living proof of it. A small number of people stood up and went, not on our watch. We are not letting the water wheel, we're not letting that building go. We need a museum. And then it grew out. 4 people became 10, 10 became 20. And here we are all this time later with a large-scale site that is endeavouring to really speak to all of those individuals and to be representative of the forthcoming generation. But yeah, I think it's part of our DNA, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, when we listened to the oral histories together, like the National Union of Shale and Oil, Labour Party, like Labour Party meetings, these kind of being interwoven into life it was extremely evident that this was, that those particular struggles, that particular drive to organize together, was really was very present in the materials, whether that be in those audio accounts or in some of the objects that we looked at as well. So yeah, I feel like there's a very, very kind of rich thread in the collection and in the holdings, which is yeah, very much about that idea of being, yeah, very politically engaged with the realities
Absolutely.
of your life and your conditions, and kind of a desire to transform and change that.
And to be a part of that change, and there's some tensions when you listen and you go back and listen to some of the recordings. It's that real tension between that sense of pride, that sense of being a part of something, that you don't necessarily always hear now, because the industries are so proliferate and they're so varied. But there's that real mixture of tension, and you hear in people's voices where they speak of real pride of being part of this industry, of that was really driven by the community. But then the flip side is, seconds later in some of those recordings, they equally talk with such passion about the hardships, about the medical challenges that remained with many people right the way throughout their life. So, and again, there's something interesting there that I think we've got more work to do to kind of bring out those narratives and find ways to give them a platform.
Yeah, absolutely. And to find the nuance in that, to find a nuanced path through these stories.
Yeah.
Catherine, do you think there are ways in which this manifests in art practice, either in extraction or in the artists you've spoken and shared with us as well?
I mean, the work that I've talked about isn't activist. It's not kind of overtly activist art practice, as we might kind of think about activist work that seeks to make a really kind of tangible change in a museum, for example. But that said, I think that doesn't mean that the more formal interests or the material interests or the visual interests of these artists is completely devoid of any engagement with the world or any kind of political consideration. Carol Rhodes, for example, was very politically active before she kind of returned to painting, and protested at Greenham Common. And the artist Neil Clements has talked about this recently in a special issue that was published in the Journal of Contemporary Painting, about how that activist legacy of Carol's career is as important for kind of contemporary artists and contemporary researchers as the painting. Not that it outweighs it or anything like that, but that people are increasingly interested in thinking about those things together, even if they're not made visibly manifest on the surface of the paintings themselves. So I think there's all sorts of kind of connections between some of these histories of organizing, particularly around the landscape and access to it, or something's being hidden from people. Greenham being another good example of a kind of intensely militarized landscape that people are being excluded from or not being able to see. And I think, yeah, without wanting to be literal or biographical about it, I think it's more that the landscape that Carol was interested in was fundamentally shaped by those processes of industrialization, militarization, and then later on a kind of shift to the service economy and deindustrialization. And you see that again in lots of other artist practices as well. And Rashid Areen, who's another of the artists that I kind of look at in the book project, has also talked about, he's got this idea in his eco-aesthetics manifesto about ideas as knowledge never being trapped as the property of an individual and an institution. So he's also an artist who's had two strands to his practice, a very formal aspect, creating abstract sculptures, but also very politically engaged in an activist practice. And I think he's thinking there about how those two things can sit alongside each other and inform each other. They're not the same thing, but they can be mutually conducive.
Yeah, I think, I was also thinking a lot kind of in the run up to the show and about Carol's activism, and how that kind of is or isn't read into the works by different people and by different writers. We had an online talk about Carol's work and legacy, and someone who attended the talk actually said that they were at Greenham with Carol, and we're still waiting on them sending us through the black and white photos that they're digging out of their archive of this. I mean, the Carol Rhodes estate already have some documentation of this, but I think that was just such a gorgeous thing to come out of this program. Actually, was someone sharing that story and that memory of her. Which is quite fantastic. I think also sometimes we can sometimes have quite a closed idea of what like a political art practice looks like. And I think as you rightly point out, like with Carol engaging with this landscape, which has all of these stories interwoven in it, as evidenced at Almond Valley, you know, I think I think sometimes we can be a bit closed in kind of what we expect political art to be like formally. So I think that's sort of my feeling when I look at a painting. Certainly that is there, or that we can consider it alongside without sort of overtly reading into things according to people's biographies. Again, finding nuanced ways to tell these stories and to kind of like weave these things together is so important. And I think that kind of brings me on to the final thing that I wanted to kind of ask you both, which is, and we touched on it a little bit in thinking about these oral histories as well, is that I think I think it can be very easy honestly, like in histories that are about work, to tell stories which overlook certain voices. Certain voices have been kind of historically excluded, and that goes for histories of art as well as for kind of our histories of our social histories and our kind of cultural histories. And Jen, obviously, I know when we were at Almond Valley together, this was something we discussed and something that the collection kind of pushes back against actually a little bit, I think. And you touched on it a bit in saying that we don't only need to talk about James Young, who's kind of considered the inventor of paraffin. I mean, you can drive through the village he was living in, and all of the signage is about him, and it's not about the people who, of course, actually made these products. Maybe we could reflect just finally together on kind of whose voice is kind of has been included, and think about where we are now and where we might be as well.
We have recently concluded a project called Project Breakout, where we invited the community and visitors to the site to really kind of consider and almost reimagine and co-design the Museum of the Future. And as part of that, we did a huge amount of engagement with local primary schools within the area, and it was really interesting to kind of, number one, see through their eyes the experience of the museum. That was a really learned experience for me, kind of seeing the lack of context for them. A paraffin lamp, we're coming to an age now, a time where the majority of our audience coming through on a daily basis have no real context of a paraffin lamp, whereas I can very easily go, I remember using one of those on a caravan holiday when we were young. So there's different narratives that I think we need to unpick, and there's a lot to do on the site in terms of interpretation and really building context into the museum, the visitor experience. But some of the most interesting conversations with the young children in particular were around that really sticky, messy area, the tension that we've talked about what we now know in terms of the planet. And the impact that the shale industry and mining and extraction as a whole has had on the planet, but also looking at the absence of various protagonists, the absence of women, and the role of girls in the industry, and the stories that we have in our archives from women that used to go around and be the people that knocked up. They were the human alarm clock. That would knock some of the miners up to get up and get out, the people that would deliver breakfast to some of the mines as well. and their absence, but also their role in really forging that community. And it's really, I suppose, inspiring, and it gives me a sense of real optimism when you sit with a generation of people who, yes, understand the impact on the landscape, but equally are open to having a really a debate, because we don't debate well anymore, do we? It's yes, no, and we don't disagree well enough. And I guess what was really interesting, I was surrounded for a period of time by 7 or 8-year-olds who had a lot to say about the planet, but were really open to a proper debate. That was wonderful. But equally, they all brought out the fact that actually, why are there no women? What, and that was really interesting to kind of then sit there and go into our archives and go into the oral histories and go, well, actually, let's listen to this. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to do in that area. There's so many stories yet to be told, and so many that we're yet to find.
Absolutely. I think it's something that, I suppose, because you've done that work coming into the archive, you almost have that knowledge to pass on to me, to us, kind of as a team, and to point us in the direction, to say, listen to that one. That one's a great account, and kind of gives you a sense of what it was like for young people as well. Like not always not always centering the same kinds of voices when we're looking at these objects.
Yeah,
absolutely. I think is so important. And thinking about the ways in which those open up for now and into the future. Those objects, those stories, like what kind of relevance do they hold? What kinds of things are young people taking from it? So yeah, it was fantastic. I think when we visited, you had a display of kind of responses and things from young people as well to the archive and the collection, which was amazing to see. So yeah, okay. Well, I'm conscious that we're actually at time. I don't know how that's an hour has passed, but I'm conscious that we are at 7:30, and mindful not to take up everyone's time. If anyone has any questions for Jen, for Catherine, for me and the curatorial team, you would be very welcome to share that in the chat. I will just give everyone like a minute in case, because I certainly always at these things am very slowly forming my question to ask. So yeah, I think I'll give everyone just a moment before we all kind of wrap up and say goodbye, just in case there are any particular things that have come up for people. And while I do that, I will actually open the chat so that I can see if anyone has sent something. So maybe I will. Oh no, I think I can carry on sharing. Oh, I'm so sorry that some of you had a real problem accessing the link, and thank you for not giving up. This is actually great. This is a heartening message to read in the chat, but I'm so sorry that you had trouble getting in. We almost had a disaster with Jen losing power at Almond Valley. So this has been a talk that has been beset by energy issues as well as by technical ones. I can see that 2 people are typing in the chat, and not to put pressure on you, but I am going to wait until you've stopped typing in case you're typing a very long question. And the other thing to say just before we go is that Janaki, our wonderful curatorial assistant, who is really the brains and power behind this entire program, has put in the chat recordings of the whole of the public program. So in this talk, I think we referred quite a lot to Carol Rhodes's practice. And if you're interested particularly in Carol's work, we had a great talk from Andrew Mummery, who's the curator of the Carol Rhodes estate, and he had lovely insights to share about Carol's practice, and shared a lot from Carol's studio as well, which is kind of a particular insight into her kind of methods of painting and working, which is lovely. So you can access that there. Janaki will also send a link for feedback on the program, which we would massively appreciate if you would fill in. Okay, someone's finished typing. A question for all of you on how you think landscape is changing and what influences this might be having on art, artists, and artifacts now. This is something that I've thought, I mean, I think in the exhibition, we think a lot about this, or I thought a lot about this, probably most closely in relation to John Gerard's work and the fact that we have this digital artwork as part of the show, which runs on electricity. And as of the start of the exhibition run, there was a really mundane day in April where it was grey skies and we switched over to solar power on site. I mean, there was no fanfare, there was nothing spectacular, it rained. But the day that we did that, and then from then on, the works have all been running on solar power, of course. And I think for me, in terms of thinking about our contemporary landscape now, I think of that solar field, and I think in the same way as the bings are now kind of waste, I think in an ideal world, solar will not be our kind of final answer, because the final answer lies in something which is maybe more efficient and more innovative. And I think, yeah, I took that very much from these kinds of conversations about the fact that what we considered to be innovative at the time, like coal, like shale, are kind of part of these wider cycles. But yeah, I don't know if that resonates. Maybe for either of you, Jen, thinking particularly towards the future and towards, well, thinking about your water wheel as well, and these kinds of alternative approaches to energy and landscape.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm always quite interested in when something becomes the norm. And I say that, you know, my mum recently moved from Liverpool to Scotland to be closer to us. And windmills are a lot more prolific across the area, and she's obsessed with the fact that at every turn she sees them. I think they're quite beautiful, to be honest, for a number of reasons. And every time I go across the sea and we drive through a certain area and she references them, I think, when will that just become a normal part of the landscape? When will they almost become unseen? So I'm quite interested in that. I think it's a really interesting question. I agree with you. I think things are evolving so quickly. I mean, photovoltaics 10, 15 years ago were hard to see within the UK, and they're already now widely prolific. But I agree. I think we're just scratching the surface. The water wheel for me is a stunning representation of something that has kind of lived a long time. I love the fact that the water wheel doesn't take, it gives back. I always talk about this with the children that are on site, this fact that it just gently lifts the water and hands it back to the landscape. And I think there's something quite beautiful in that idea and in that ideology, maybe. But I think globally, the landscape has been irrevocably changed, hasn't it, through extraction? And mining is the industry that has absolutely led that. So yes, I think it's interesting to kind of see how it will shift the artist's perspective going forward.
Yeah, I really like the question, and I think obviously all of these practices are responding to these changes and these layers. There's also something I think that an artwork can do that is about duration and is about holding memories and traces of what's gone before, and also that at the same time is able to think ahead into the future. And I think actually John Latham's work within the show is a really good example of that. I cannot pretend to always understand what John Latham's talking about in his work, but at the same time there was that visionary, you know, I think he recognized the shale bings as both monuments, as both traces or residues, but he also had a sense that they would be important, that was still important to keep and to have in the future. So there was a kind of simultaneous backwards and forwards looking in the practice, the very conceptual practice that he developed around the shale bings. But I also think that Carol's work And maybe Siobhan's work too in a similar way in its interaction with the landscape and with the Bings can operate in a similar way. And funnily enough, I was looking at Carol's paintings the other day and I was just thinking, well, some of these structures could be data centers. She wasn't painting a data center, but they could be. So there are elements of our landscape that have continuities or shapes that are very ubiquitous, but are hiding different things. And I think she was interested in that capacity of these infrastructures as well, to also to hide in plain sight, which I think is something that comes up across a lot of these practices. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Lovely reflection. Yeah, you're so right. They could be data centers. It's interesting because like the other John Gerard has also made work that simulates the data center, and thinking about some of the forms in that simulation and in Carol's painting is super interesting. And I can't believe that we mentioned kind of activism or campaigning and I didn't mention John Latham's campaign for the Bings to kind of not be flattened, which as a kind of proposition is the reason that Carol could paint them, and the reason that Siobhan now can kind of walk on the Bings and collect pigment from them for her paintings. So that understanding that these could serve as kind of monuments in a very varied and rich sense is really powerful. I don't want us to keep us for too much longer, but Siobhan is actually here. Siobhan, why didn't we have you? Why aren't you here on camera with us? But she's put a lovely comment in the chat, which is maybe a nice thing to end on. Not a question, but just to say that I loved visiting Almond Valley as part of my research over the past couple of years, and I look forward to visiting again soon and seeing how the space evolves with the many stories yet to be told and yet to be found, as you said, Jenny. And she also notes that the maps were particularly fascinating, and she took one of the references on a map at the museum for a title in one of her works. So these kind of lines between what you're doing at Almond Valley with the collection, the archive, with thinking through these stories. I mean, thinking through a whole site in terms of how communities create their own cultural identities and how they evolve and change and how they look to the future. And then this through line into artistic practice just feels beautifully summed up. Siobhan, you've given us an absolutely beautiful ending as well as beautiful work in the show. Really all that's left for me to do is to say thank you both so much for joining me this evening in conversation. It's been, I feel we could talk about so many other things, and this has sent so many different kind of threads, kind of electrifying all of these different lines in my brain, thinking from kind of object to artwork together, which has just been so rich. So thank you both so much, and thank you for everyone who's joined us. We will circulate. Janiky's put feedback there, and we will circulate the link to anyone who couldn't make it as well. Thank you so much for being here, and hope you have a good rest of the evening.
Thank you.